Today's reading comes from Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 to 18. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere. What is man, that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man, that you care for him? You made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation I sing your praise. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. Since therefore the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise partook of the same things, that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. For surely it is not angels that he helps, but he helps the offspring of Abraham. Therefore he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make propitiation for the sins of the people. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted.
Hello and welcome back to our Hebrew series at Warrnambool District Baptist Church. This is our third week in the series. Glad you could join us. This week in America, in Congress, the Democratic Party has introduced a new police reform bill in response to the outrage that took place following the death of George Floyd in police custody. And the bill is called the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. Now, the reality is it's unlikely this bill will become law. The Senate will probably vote it down, and even if it passes the Senate, the President has said he'll veto the law. But for today's purposes, it's interesting to see that this bill has the name of the man who was killed as part of its title, to acknowledge, I guess, what began this review and this action, and maybe as a sign as well that this name will not be forgotten, that his life had value. In fact, that's kind of what the whole Black Lives Matter movement is kind of about. This movement was reignited by these events, and it's really reflected in that name, Black Lives Matter. It's focused on the equality, if you like, of human value. A minority in the United States firmly declaring their belief that they have been undervalued historically or considered of lesser value. It's a good question for us to ask, I think. How valuable are humans? How valuable are human beings? From a worldly perspective, there's a few different views on this, perhaps. The perhaps traditional atheist modernist perspective would be that humans are extremely valuable in this world. We are the highest being on the food chain, if you like. No other species has the sort of same technological or self-developmental capabilities that we do. We're sort of the pinnacle of the universe, particularly if you don't believe in a God. More recently, sort of within atheism, this has probably been challenged, perhaps as modernism has moved to postmodernism. Some, like the ethicist Peter Singer, has seen this view as speciest, prioritising and valuing one species ahead of others. Some perhaps more extreme members of the environmental movement have identified humans as actually the biggest problem to our planet, causing trouble for all other species alive. How do we answer this question as followers of Jesus? How valuable are humans? See, it's a tricky question because we kind of have a three-part identity. On one hand, we are created in the image of God. We are, below God, the pinnacle of God's creation. We're given honour and value by the Creator. On the other hand, of course, we are caught up in sin and disobedience from God, and we're separated from God, and we're not worthy of God's love. But then we know, despite our guilt and our sin, we are loved by God more than we could ever imagine, to the extent of God sending his own Son, Jesus, to die for our sakes so we could be part of God's family. How valuable are humans? Well, today is our third week in our Hebrews series, and this book's a fascinating book of the Bible in our New Testament. It was written in the 60s AD by an unknown author, and it was written to a group of Jewish background Christians, but living outside of Israel, probably or possibly even in Rome. The book of Hebrews was written to show these Christians the centrality and importance of Jesus in God's plan. Our series in Hebrews will go for 18 weeks in sort of 3 parts of 6 weeks each. So today we're in week 3 of part 1. In the last couple of weeks, we looked at the importance of God's revelation in Jesus, and the author exalted Jesus' role in how we know what God is really like. The author used these wonderful descriptions to explain how Jesus is God in human flesh. So in verse 2, chapter 1, he wrote, "The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being." Today's focus is all on the other side of the coin. Rather than focusing on how Jesus is God, the author now focuses on how Jesus is human. Let me encourage you, have your Bibles open if you like. We're looking at Hebrews chapter 2, verses 5 to 18. The author begins by quoting from Psalm 8 in the Old Testament. This psalm is a beautiful psalm of praise to God, and it's about how God cares for humanity, how God, who is above and greater than anything, incredibly gives humans his love and care, despite making us, the psalmist says, a little lower than the angels in some way. Despite this, God places all creation under our stewardship and gives humans an honoured destiny. Let me read from verse 5 of Hebrews 2. "It is not to angels that he subjected the world to come about which we are speaking, but there is a place where someone has testified, 'What is mankind that you are mindful of them, a son of man that you care for him? You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honour and put everything under their feet.' In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at present we do not see everything subject to them." At the end, there's this little comment, isn't there, from the author. He says, despite this promise of God for humans, this wonderful promise, he says we don't quite see that rule and glory at the moment, which I think is true when you think about it. Now, certainly there is a sense in which humans do have control over this world. There is no other species that rules as we do. And yet, because of the fall, because of human rebellion against God, because of our sin, our intended role in creation isn't as it once was. We considered this in our previous series, Lament and Hope, that the world has also been infected by human sin. And we see the consequences of this in many ways, including the kind of twisting of nature that leads to, say, natural disasters. So yes, humans do have other species sort of under their control, but we don't have mastery over volcanoes or earthquakes or tsunamis or bushfires. And some species, including relevantly perhaps some viruses, sometimes have mastery over us. And what about the psalmist's view of human glory and honour here? Now, as I mentioned before, since we're made in God's image, there is a sense in which this is very true. And yet it's not immediately obvious. Humans don't always act, do they, in ways that are glorious and honourable. Sometimes we act in ways that are petty or vindictive or even evil. I wonder how you would describe a royal child who has become a brat. Maybe imagine if, Prince William's oldest son, George, little George, imagine if he just went right off the rails. Well, yes, by birthright, he has an honoured place, he has an honoured name. But I mean, at the rate he's going, he's trashing his good name. He's certainly not going to be honoured by anyone soon. I wonder if that could be a picture of what humanity is like right now. See, the author affirms humans have glory and honour and also God's care and attention and a promised rule. But the reality is we don't see that at the moment. Let's keep reading. The author then compares what we don't see in humans at present with what we do see in Jesus. Verse 9. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honour because he suffered death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what he suffered. These are probably the most complex verses in this chapter. The author is saying, while we don't see humans fulfilling their proper role of rulership and stewardship, we do see Jesus, also human, also temporarily made a little lower than the angels, that's the expression. We see him doing this. Jesus is crowned with glory and honour as he now rules at God's right hand. What's the point of Jesus doing kind of what humans were meant to do? Well, in verse 10, it says Jesus is a pioneer. Now, depending on your Bible translation, you might have a word like author or captain or even archetype. This word's used a few times in the Bible. I think pioneer is a pretty good fit here. See, a pioneer is someone who goes before the crowd, who leads the way. We talk of, pioneering medical science, those who make that breakthrough that then others will follow. I'm sure very soon we'll be using that word to describe, whichever team finds the vaccine for COVID-19 first. They will be the pioneers and others will follow. This is important here, I think. See, Jesus became human, a little lower than the angels. Jesus suffered and died. Jesus was raised to glory and honour and rules the world rightly. Not just to do what humanity has been unable to do, and not just to fulfill that destiny of humanity, of honour and glory and right rule, but actually to pave the way for us to enjoy honour and glory and rule as well. In verse 10, it says that Jesus became perfect through what he suffered. Now, perfect here means something like complete, rather than, say, suggesting Jesus was imperfect before his suffering. No, rather through Jesus' suffering, he completed his journey of obedience and faithfulness to God. And again, this is so that humans might also become complete. It says that in suffering and fulfilling his journey of faithfulness, Jesus brought many sons and daughters to glory. Jesus is the pioneer for us. Jesus paves the way for us. Just as Jesus suffered and died to complete his mission, to become complete, so he brings us to glory or completion, as well as he allows us to fulfill the destiny of glory and honour that was meant for us. These are complex verses, but they point to a very important outcome. Jesus identifies with us strongly. Jesus identifies with us. In the last chapter, we looked at how glorious and godly and holy Jesus was. But here the focus is Jesus' identification with humans, that Jesus was himself fully human. He lived and died as a human. And now, even in glory, he's paving the way for those humans who know him to follow to their own honour and glory and rightful rulership. And the author kind of goes one step further in the next verse. Not only does Jesus strongly identify with us as part of humanity, but he even sees us as his family. From verse 11, both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly, I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here am I and the children God has given me. The author quotes from two Old Testament examples here, Psalm 22 and Isaiah 8. Examples of someone faithfully following God for the sake of others. And then seeing those others they're trying to help, striving for, as their brothers and sisters, or even as their children. The author says Jesus falls right into this line of behaviour. Jesus has incredible solidarity with those he rescues as his own family. Now, it's hard to kind of find a helpful analogy or image to show what Jesus does here. Let me try. This is to do with giving aid. So on one hand, politicians represent the government, and they'll often visit places in need to give large grants of money to, say, poor communities or community groups in need. Now, of course, these grants are very welcome by those who receive them, and they're often large. The government has access to a lot of funding and financial support. But if we're being honest, let's lay it out there. Most politicians, they love a photo op. They love to get a photo with the people they're helping for their magazine or their website. And then they get back in their car, of course, they wave goodbye and go back to their comfortable lives and houses. On the other hand, some organisations, I've got one in mind, Urban Neighbours of Hope is a good example. They intentionally plant families in the middle of at-risk neighbourhoods, so they might have solidarity with the people they're reaching, and as much as possible become one of them. Now, the actual tangible resources that they bring are nothing like what a large government grant could provide, but they do help where they can. They would be the first to admit, though, their aim is more on creating community than just providing financial relief and rescue. It's a bit of a crude analogy here, but Jesus provides the rescue power of the most generous government grant you could imagine, with the most authentic community solidarity possible. See, Jesus is born a human. He lives among his people for 33 years. As the author suggests, he calls them his brothers and sisters. He's genuinely one of them. He identifies as such. And yet he also provides that one thing everyone needs, salvation. And so we rightly call Jesus both our brother and our pioneer, as he identifies strongly with us and he paves the way to honour and glory for us. Well, in the final section of this passage, we get a glimpse at how Jesus does this, how Jesus becoming human actually brings about our salvation. And again, pretty quickly here and with some complexity, the author considers two different sides of our salvation. And in each, he looks at how Jesus being human was really crucial. So firstly, he considers our slavery to sin and its consequence, which is death. And he declares that Jesus rescues us from death. From verse 14, since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by their fear of death. Here death is described as slavery for humanity, which is true, I think. Death is the sentence from which none of us can avoid. And fear of death is a form of slavery for humanity. It's kind of always there in our minds and in our hearts. We know it's coming up one day. And yet because Jesus became human and went through even death and then rose again to new life, he has defeated the power of death over us. Again, he's the pioneer, isn't he? He's been through death to the other side and he's returned to tell the tale. And this means if we have faith in Jesus, we can follow that path. Death doesn't have to be the end. There is life after death with Jesus. But this is only possible because Jesus died a human death. Otherwise, he wouldn't have broken the power of death over us. Jesus had to be human to save humans from the power of death. And secondly, the author considers our guilt for sin and disobedience from God and declares that Jesus offers a sacrifice for our sake. From verse 17, for this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. A bit later in Hebrews, we'll look at how Jesus is both the sacrifice and the priest who offers that sacrifice to God. Here the focus is that as a human, he is the perfect mediator between God and us. As a human, Jesus bridges that gap between humanity and God. And as a human, Jesus is the sacrifice that represents all human sin and guilt and rebellion from God. See, humanity had rejected God. Humanity had been separated from God. Humanity needed to be made right with God. And in Jesus, humanity was rightly punished by God. And in Jesus, humanity was reconciled to God. In Jesus, humanity was restored to a relationship with God. See, Jesus needed to be human to save humans. See, as victims of sin, firstly, we needed to be saved from our slavery to sin and death. As a human, Jesus did that. And as agents of sin, we needed to be saved from our guilt before God. As a human, Jesus did that. The last verse then reminds us of one other thing that we have through Jesus being human. Jesus knows what it's like. Verse 18, because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. For some, this is probably the most encouraging part of Jesus being human. He knows what human life is like with all its suffering and all its temptation. I wonder if this is particularly helpful for you at the moment. I don't know exactly what you're going through or what life is like for you, but maybe there's a particular temptation you're finding hard at the moment. Or maybe there's suffering you're going through that's seriously difficult. Hear this from Hebrews. Jesus became human to identify with humans. I don't know what you're going through, but Jesus does. Jesus knows, and Jesus has experienced it. Jesus has suffered. Jesus has been tempted. Jesus knows what it's like to be human. Well, how valuable are humans? How valuable are humans? Recently, I read a couple of articles online about the difference between the words unworthy and worthless. There was an open letter from someone called Tony Payne, and the letter is Dear Worthless Cockroach. Dear Worthless Cockroach by Tony Payne. You can look it up if you like. And articles like this made the distinction between unworthy and worthless. I think this is really helpful when we think about the value of humans. See, it's true that I am unworthy. The Bible is honest that I have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. I know by my own efforts I am unworthy of God's love and care. In the parable of the prodigal son, for example, in Luke 15, when the son returns contrite to his father, he says this in his speech, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. That's right. I am unworthy. And yet, I am not worthless. See, worthless implies an absence of any worth or value of any sort. And we know this cannot be true. All human beings have worth and value created in God's image. In Genesis 1:27, we famously read in the creation account, God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And then God, we know, looked upon his human creatures and declared that they were very good. And we also know the value and worth of humans by the very fact that Jesus came and died for our sake. Jesus never came, as a dog to save dogs or as an ant to die for ants. No, Jesus came as a human to die for humans, affirming in this our value in the eyes of God. Today's passage reminds us of this very clearly. In fact, verses 5 and 16, they almost kind of bookend the passage. It's a reminder of how we compare to angels. Might seem like a strange reminder, but we've just read how apparently humans are somehow a little lower than the angels. And yet the author writes this: it is not to angels that he, that's God, has subjected the world to come about which we are speaking. And then verse 18, for surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants, humans. Jesus came as a human to save humans. And finally, we see human value again in how Jesus sees his followers as his brothers and sisters. This is a more specific value that God gives those who know Jesus. And what a value it is to be considered brothers and sisters of Jesus the King. See, humans, including you, including me, have value. Not because we're somehow worthy in our own right, not because we're righteous and holy in what we do, not because we deserve heaven and salvation. No, in fact, it's almost the opposite. We know we're valuable because we are unworthy to receive salvation. And yet, at incredible cost, God sent his son Jesus to be a human fully and completely, to die for our sakes, so that we might be bestowed with honour and glory. The fact that God did this for us demonstrates our worth and value in his eyes. Thanks be to God for his salvation through Jesus.